Hey guys, so in this video we'll be doing a player ranking for Survivor, David versus Goliath, as a follow-up to my season power ranking for that season. And this ended up being a pretty interesting list. I was actually a bit surprised with some of these placements, but we'll get to that soon enough. But there are 20 players to talk about, and let's waste any more time. Let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 20, the player I believe played the worst game on this season is probably not the person you're expecting, but I feel like it's largely warranted. And here we have Jeremy Crawford. And the thing about Jeremy is that he was pretty much on the outs for the entire season, never really having anyone outside of Mike. But even then, Mike was willing to turn on him by the time they go to Tribal, to where he is voted out unanimously at the first Tribal that they attend. Now, even before that, he did some stuff that rubbed some people the wrong way, like telling people that John and Angelina had a showmance. You also have him searching Dan's jacket to find the idol there. You also have him telling people to not have game talks. And again, all this is pretty bad. And the fact that he goes out over Natalie, who seemed to be a pretty consensus target coming into it, is such an indictment to his game that despite him making it to the third round, I feel like he played the worst game on the season for me, which is why he's here number 20. Now moving on to number 19, and we have someone who I just mentioned, and here we have Natalie Cole. And again, Natalie's a fantastic character, and I did talk about her in my history of Natalie's video, but she did play a pretty terrible game, and kind of similar to Jeremy, she never really had anyone on her side aside from Jeremy, but even then they kind of blow up their relationship by the end of it. And she's pretty much regarded as a consensus target for a lot of their season, where the reason she isn't taken out at the Jeremy round is because Jeremy was more of a pariah by that point. And at the swap, she is pretty much a consensus target there, where even though it's a 3-2 vote, I feel like Angelina only voted with her to try to get her jacket, but even then she had kind of turned on her by that point anyway. So really it's a mostly bad game, never really had anyone on her side. The main reason I have her above Jeremy is that she technically outplayed Jeremy in the round that he went out, but aside from that, there isn't really anything else to praise here, which is why she's here at number 19. Now moving on to number 18, and we have the person that people were probably expecting to be at the bottom, but actually had them a couple spots higher, and here we have Pat Cusack, the first boot of the season. And again, Pat was medevaced in the first round of the game, and it does seem like he would have been a target had they gone to that tribal council, and probably would have gone home had they gone to that tribal. But I think what puts Pat above Jeremy and Natalie is that he had a pretty solid alliance behind him, where coming into that first vote, he had the likes of Carl, Jessica, and B on his side, and I felt like that would have been a sizable minority right there. Now granted, I'm not entirely convinced he would have won out on that vote and he probably would have been voted out there, but I feel like the fact that he had allies, the fact that he had this solid alliance to begin with, was enough to have him above the likes of Jeremy and Natalie for me, who I feel like didn't even have that. But beyond that, I can't have him too high considering he was still taken out early in the game, which is why he's here at number 18. Now moving on to number 17, and we have someone very similar to Pat, and here we have Jessica Pete. And Jessica was again part of this alliance along with Pat, Carl, and B. That would have been a force during that first tribal, but probably would have been the minority there. But then after Pat goes, we do see her becoming the next target on the board due to her being seen as the most threatening person within that minority alliance, due to her being seen as this glue between B and Carl, causing her to be sniped out. But at the same time, it was a 5-4 vote, so I don't really know how much to fault her for that. But at the same time, I feel like considering that she was technically the next person taken out after Pat, I'm not entirely sure what to make of her game. But considering she is still a pretty early boot in the season, I do have her here number 17. Now moving on to number 16, and we have another person of this David Minority Alliance, and here we have B, who obviously quits the game after sustaining an injury after the third immunity challenge. Now again, she has some similar issues to Pat and Jessica in the sense that she was in the minority early on, but I will also say she did have some connections to the other side. She did have a close bond with Gabby at one point, though we later see her blame Gabby for the Jessica blindside, even though she was probably one of the least integral to that plan happening, which isn't a great look, but I still think she probably would have been safe had they gone to another tribal. But obviously we do see her quitting the game after her injury, so in some ways her game is a bit of an unknown, but still she's a relatively early boot, which is why she's here number 16. Now moving on to number 15, and we are continuing to stick with the boot order here, and here we have Natalia. And I did struggle a bit with Natalia's game, as she did seem to be in a good position at one point where early on we did see her having this tight core with Angelina and Kara, and there was talk about creating the 6-person alliance along with Dan, John, and Alec, with her supposedly having Alec there, though we have learned afterwards that she wasn't actually that close to Alec in a game sense, and Alec was, in general, the least committal to the six-person alliance to begin with, but still she was part of the majority early on, get through the Jeremy vote alright. But then we get to the swap where I do think she plays it kind of sloppily, where at that point the targets become Elizabeth and Davy, the two Davids there, and we see her going all in on targeting Elizabeth due to her supposed relationship with Kara. And with Alec being pretty opposed to this plan, I think that's a big reason why Alec ends up flipping to the David side, which I do think is a misstep on her end. I feel like she would have had a bit more success in getting Alec on her side had she been open to targeting Davy there, but due to her being worried about Elizabeth, I do feel like she kind of contributes to her own downfall there. But even beyond that, I feel like she's still a pretty early boot, which is why she's here at number 15. Now moving on to number 14, and we're actually wrapping up the pre-merge here, and here we have Lyrsa. And I did also debate on Lyrsa a bit. I did consider having her below Natalya initially, as she was a pretty big target during a lot of the pre-merge, where obviously during that second round, she is the main target by the minority group. She barely survives in a 5-4 vote due to her being perceived as a challenge weakness, but I do have to give her some credit for having Elizabeth, having that close bond with her that allowed Elizabeth to steer the votes away from her and onto Jessica instead. And even after the Jessica vote, we do see Lyrsa's target going down to where people like Gabby become bigger targets, for instance. So again, not too bad there. She then gets a pretty bad swap where she is down numbers, and I do think she is outplayed by Nick here, where Nick does a much better job of building inroads with the likes of Mike and Angelina there, to where she's clearly on the outs. And while she does survive the Natalie Cole vote, I do think she's a consensus target at the next round. So on the whole, I feel like Lyrsa is a pretty interesting game, one in which she definitely has some pros in the sense of having an alliance at one point, but was also targeted a good amount considering how deep in the game she made it, to where she's here number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and we are now moving on to the merge boot of the season, and here we have Elizabeth. And I also debated on where to put Elizabeth here, as I feel like her game has some highs, but also some pretty low lows. Now, I do think early on she does some good work. She does have that bond with Lyrsa. When they do go to tribal, she is a key factor in putting the votes onto Jessica. She's the one to put the target onto Jessica. So I do feel like that's pretty good work there. And she is part of the majority early on. I wouldn't say she's necessarily in the core of things, where I feel like Christian and Nick are more so in the driver's seat, but she is part of the majority. But then we get to the swap where she is put into a pretty bad situation where she is targeted at that first tribal by Natalya due to her relationship with Kara. And while she does survive that to where Alec flips at her side, I feel like moving forward, she's not in the greatest spot in the world. And after Carl joins their tribe, she does build a very hostile relationship with Carl. To her coming to the merge, Carl wants nothing to do with her, which I do feel like you have to knock her for. And then we get to the merge where she is seen as this pretty disposable person in the game, to where she is voted out unanimously there, which is really bad. And in general, I feel like Elizabeth's game is kind of hard to assess, where I do feel like there are points where she does some good work, particularly early on, but I feel like her game kind of goes downhill as it goes on. And I feel like the fact that she is thrown out so easily at the merge is such a bad look to me that I have her here number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we have someone I also debated on a good amount. I consider having this person below Elizabeth at a point, but I do feel like they were in the majority for more of their run, and that person is Dan. And I think Dan played a pretty mediocre game for the most part, though I feel like he was in the majority for at least most of his run. Now early on, he had his showmance with Kara, which did put a target on his back, though he was still part of the majority group, and he probably would have been pulled into the 6-person alliance along with Kara, and they're able to get through those early votes all right. After the swap, I do think he's part of the majority initially, where he and John are able to build this connection with Christian, though I do feel like had they gone to tribal later on in the swap, I do feel like he would have been a pretty massive target, as Gabby and Allison were gunning for him, and really it comes down to Christian's vote if they go back to tribal there. So I do feel like he was in quite a bit of danger had they gone the tribal there, to where he probably would have needed to use his idol, though who knows if he would have used it. And then we get to the merge where he is part of the Goliath alliance that does have the numbers initially, and they are able to get their way in taking out Elizabeth. In the following round, they do have the majority of the votes in taking out Christian, though they end up being outplayed by the Davids, where the Davids play their idol on Christian, which forces him to use his idol on Angelina, someone he didn't even have that good of a relationship to begin with, only to then lose John on, which is a major blow to Dan's game considering they were closely aligned for a lot of the season. And then coming to the next round, he is the biggest target on the Goliath side to where even his own showmans in Kara flips on him, which I think is an even bigger knock against his game. The fact that his own closest ally flips on him relatively early on, and while he does get screwed over by the idol nullifier to where he plays his idol, only for it to get nullified and he gets taken out, he obviously was the majority's target anyway. And even if he had gone through that round by playing an idol, I still would have knocked that against his game as he needed an idol at that point. And I just don't see a path for him to get to the end considering it was the final 11 and he probably would have needed to win out or find more idols, which seems pretty unlikely there. So in a lot of ways, I feel like Dan played a pretty mediocre game where he was a pretty massive target from this swap on. And while you can say he got unlucky by things like the John Hennigan blindside and the idol nullifier, I think there are other things you can point to that he did wrong in the game, like him not being in the core of the majority early on where it seemed like the women were more so in the driver's seat. Also him harming his relationship with people like Angelina and later with Kara, that really made it so that he was pretty doomed for a lot of the game, and that's a big reason why he's here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and I actually consider putting this person higher considering the way in which he got taken out. But at the end of the day, I just couldn't really justify it, but we do have John Hennigan. And John really gets sniped out of the game here in a minority vote split, which had never happened before and required such a level of difficulty that a lot of the Goliaths simply weren't expecting, where the assumption coming into that round was to pile their votes onto Christian, and if they played the idol on Christian, then they would just let Angelina go there, or possibly have Dan play his idol on Angelina, which would have cost 0 votes tribal, to where the Goliaths would have had the numbers anyway. It really seemed coming into it that the Goliaths didn't have much to worry about, but due to the way in which the Davids navigate through that round, it really leads to John just being taken out here in a very unconventional way. And I think I did consider putting him higher because of this, considering the level of difficulty required to take out someone like John this early in the game. But at the same time, I just couldn't justify it considering I feel like his game before that, while he was in the majority for most of his run, I don't think it was impressive enough to really justify him being much higher. And even if he had survived this round, I just don't see him getting all the way to the end considering how blatant of a threat he seemed to be. Now again, early on, he was part of the majority group. He was aligned with Angelina, and he was on board with the 6-person alliance alongside the women, along with Dan and Alec. And obviously, they do get through those early rounds all right. After the swap, he does build this bond with Dan, though at the same time, I do feel like he doesn't do more to build a game relationship with Christian, where even though they connected well on a personal level, and we do see them bonding there, I feel like they didn't really talk much game there, and I feel like had they gone the tribal, I don't really know which side Christian goes with, whether with the John and Dan side to take out Gabby, or with the Gabby and Allison side to take out Dan. Now again, I think John himself would have been pretty safe there had they gone the tribal, but I don't think it's a surefire thing that he would have won at the vote there, and he very well could have been on the outs there, but they obviously never go to tribal, and early on the merge, he is part of that Goliath alliance that has the numbers, but at the same time, I feel like he doesn't really do enough to bond more with the Davids, or even though he has good relationships with Gabby and Christian, as I talked about earlier, they weren't really game relationships, and they weren't really enough to keep the target off of him, and a big reason why Nick chooses to target John over other Goliaths is because John lied to him about keeping Christian around, and considering that Nick didn't really trust John at that point and didn't really have much of a relationship with him, that made it easy for Nick to put the votes onto John at the point that they're putting together this plan. So even within that, I do think John did some things wrong during his boot round to justify his boot. It's just that in a lot of cases, that mistake wouldn't have mattered at that point, as I feel like he was assuming that he would just remain Goliath strong for those early rounds, but then bond with the Davids later. But I feel like the fact that he wasn't more proactive early on in the merge, despite him being with this Goliath group, is what holds him back compared to other Goliaths that were able to have those relationships and were able to save stay for more of the game. So again, I do find John's game here a bit hard to assess, but I feel like 11 is a pretty good spot to have him. Now moving on to number 10, and I really struggle with these next two. I didn't really know what to make of them, as I feel like their games are on pretty similar levels. But number 10, I did decide to go with the earlier boot of these two, and that person is Carl. And Carl played a pretty interesting game here, particularly in the post-merge. However, I feel like early on his game is mostly rocky. Where early on he is part of the minority, he is aligned with the likes of Jessica, B, and Pat. And obviously they do lose out on those early rounds, losing Pat and Jessica back to back. That's not particularly great, but he's able to scrape on until the merge, where he is sent to exile and he's able to get the idol nullifier out of that. But then he gets put onto the Orange Tribe, where the Davids do have the majority there, and they should be able to run that group. However, we also see him building this pretty hostile relationship with Elizabeth, to where those two don't really want to work together coming to the merge. And we do see him putting the target onto Elizabeth's back at the merge, though I don't really think that was necessarily in his best interest strategically, but they are able to get through that vote all right. After that, he does work with the other Davids to get one up on the Goliaths, which is pretty good. And then the following round, I feel like he is the main person targeting Dan there, and he is the one to use his idol nullifier to get Dan out. Emily is technically lumped in with the likes of Nick and Davey, as they're the ones with all the advantages at that point. We also see him becoming a target at the final 9, where at that point, we do see the likes of Gabby and Allison wanting to target him, and the fact that Gabby and Christian do flip on him is not particularly great, especially considering he was the least lucky winner of Nick and Davey at that point. So again, I do have to fault him for his eventual boot round for coming off as this big leader, but at the same time, I don't feel like he was necessarily the ringleader of the Davids group. I feel like he was working more so alongside Nick and Davey, and again, I feel like he was probably the least lucky winner of those three. But I do find Carl's game here a bit interesting, where I feel like you do have to give him some credit for things that happened after the merge, though at the same time, I feel like you have to give more credit to other people, namely Nick and Davey. That and also his earlier game is a bit rocky at points, which is why he's here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and in a lot of ways, I consider this person's game around the same level as Carl's, but this person technically outplays Carl in his eventual boot round, and that person is Gabby. And I did kind of struggle with Gabby. I wasn't entirely sure what to make of her game. Now early on, she is in a good spot on the initial David tribe, being part of the majority there, but also having ties to the other side with people like B, and she is technically a swing vote during the Jessica vote, though at the same time we also see Nick and Christian throwing her under the bus after that round, even though they were the ones that flipped. That causes the likes of B to blame her for that move. She gets a pretty bad swap to where she's at the bottom for a lot of that, though she also builds a good bond with Allison, to where had they gone to tribal before the merge, I do think she could have gotten one up there and taking out a Dan, but obviously they never go to tribal. After the merge, she is on the bottom initially, where they do take out Elizabeth there, but then the following round, she is working alongside the Davids and taking out the likes of John and Dan. But I do feel like she is on the bottom of the David group, where the John Hennigan blindside, I feel like she probably has the least to do of that plan out of any of the Davids, which I don't really give her that much credit for her there. And while she is part of the David's plans for the next couple rounds, we later see Angelina replacing her within the David alliance, which I don't think is particularly great either. That does later cause her to flip at the Fallen 9 alongside Christian to take out Carl. So technically she does get a 1-up on Carl there, but then the following round, we do see her try to make her move by trying to blindside Christian, and she does get the numbers to do so, mainly relying on people like Nick and Davey being pretty mad at Christian for having flipped with her the previous round, though obviously it doesn't quite work out. Christian plays an idol, she gets idled out in turn, though I will also say that even if her plan had worked, I don't think she would have been set up well for the end game, as it does seem like she would have been on the bottom alongside Allison and Kara the following round, and she probably would have been picked off not too long afterwards, where I think ideally for Gabby, she should have tried to keep both Christian and Allison around to the final 6, trying to flush Christians out along the way, take out Christian at the final 6, and then try to get to the end against Angelina and Kara, as I feel like that would have set her up the best to win the game. So in a way, I feel like she made the move a bit too early, though at the same time she would have had the numbers to do so anyway, and she obviously gets idled out. So it is kind of a tough game to assess, to where she is technically on the bottom for a decent amount of her run, and it's not until the tail end that we do see her having a bit of agency, only to immediately be sniped out of the game afterwards. And I feel like moving forward, I just find it hard to see how to win the jury vote unless she's against Angelina and Kara, and I feel like her end game was not set up particularly well, to where I do have her here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have someone who I just mentioned, and here we have Christian Hubicki. And Christian obviously plays a pretty interesting game here, mainly because of how massive of a target he is for really a lot of his run, especially in the post-merge. but I do feel like he was more integral within his alliances for more of the game compared to Gabby. Now, early on, we do see him being part of the majority on the original David tribe. We see him being pretty close to the likes of Nick and Gabby, and they are pretty integral swing votes during the Jessica round, where they are able to take out Jessica there, and is able to remain in a good spot afterwards. After the swap, he is put in a bad spot alongside Gabby, but I do think he does a better job at building bonds with the other side, where we do see people like John and Dan liking him. And while I don't think it's necessarily a game relationship to where I do feel like he would have continued to work with Gabby moving forward, I do feel like he does enough work there to where they wouldn't have targeted him at that point. So again, pretty good stuff there. But then we get to the merge, which is where things get very complicated. Now right at the bat, he is pulled into the Strikeforce alliance alongside Gabby and Nick, which should have gotten him a bit of safety within the game. And we do see Elizabeth being a pretty consensus target there, though at the same time we do see Angelina wanting to target him at that point, but the other Goliaths simply don't listen to him, but he's able to get through that first round pretty well. But then the very next round, the final 11, he's already being targeted, and the Strikeforce alliance that he was pulled into immediately crumbles to where all the Goliaths that he was aligned to are on board to take him out, to where he needs an idol to save himself, which is not particularly great. And while I can give him some credit for having relationships with people like Nick that are able to get the information to pull off this move, I feel like the fact that he himself didn't do more in this round is a pretty big knock to his game. After that, we do see him being part of the eventual Dan boot, though at the same time, I feel like other people like Nick, Davey, and Carl were more integral in making that plan happen, but he's able to get through that round alright. And we also see him building bonds with people like Mike that allows him to remain relatively safe for the next couple rounds regardless. At the final 10, he does win immunity, that's pretty good. Final 9, he and Gabby are the swing votes that flip the game on Carl. Then we get to the final 8, where his closest ally, Gabby, flips on him, wanting to move for her resume, to where he needs another idol to save himself there, is able to do so. But then at final 7, he is once again being targeted, and at that point, he is eventually taken out. So in some ways, his game is hard to assess, as on one hand, I do feel like he has some solid alliances at certain points. I feel like he was pretty well positioned for a lot of the pre-merge, and even after the merge, we do see him building bonds with people like Mike and the other Davids that allow him to get through pivotal rounds of the game. But at the same time, he was such a massive threat from so early on in the game. The fact that he needs 2 idols to get through certain rounds of the game is pretty bad. And moving forward, I feel like he probably struggles to get to the end unless he wins out from that point. Now, mind you, I feel like that also makes him a bigger jury threat to where I feel like he probably would win if he got to the end. But I feel like the fact that he was targeted for so much of the post-merge really speaks to bad threat management, which is why he's here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we actually have the earliest boot left on the board to talk about, and here we have Alec Merlino. And this may be a little high, though, considering the people that are immediately before him, I do think it largely makes sense, as I feel like Alec was a pretty big player for a lot of his run, and while I don't necessarily agree with all of his decisions, I do feel like it was interesting seeing him navigate the game. Now early on, he is part of the original David Alliance alongside Natalia, Angelina, and Kara, though at the same time, he was supposedly the least on board with that 6-person alliance, but still, he is in a good spot initially. After the swap, he is put into the swing vote position at that first vote, and he does choose to take out Natalia, which I don't necessarily agree with, considering how close he and Natalia seem to be early on. And while we see Kara being pretty upset with him afterwards, I feel like he remains pretty safe for the rest of the pre-merge. At the merge, he's put in a pretty interesting position where he's essentially riding the middle between the Strikeforce alliance alongside Mike and Allison, but also with the Goliath alliance, where he has pretty big threats on both sides. And this allows him to navigate the game for the next couple rounds, where at the Elizabeth vote, pretty consensus target there. After that, the Goliath Alliance does tie his hands in voting for Christian, though at the same time, we do see him leaking the plan to Nick, and while he wasn't the only person to do so, it does seem like he did this as a way of giving Nick permission to blow up the game. And while I don't think it entirely works out the way he expects, where John Hennigan is taken out, I don't necessarily fault him for the way that he played that round. But after that, we do see Dan being taken out, which I also think doesn't help his game, considering Dan was the other major threat on the Goliath side. And then afterwards, he's a pretty consensus target to where he has to win immunity or else he's toast. At the point where he doesn't, he is voted out unanimously there, which is pretty bad. And I did consider putting him a little bit lower, as he's already pretty high for his placement on the season. but I do feel like I have bigger holes with the likes of Gabby, Carl, and Christian's game that does leave Alec a bit higher here. Though at the same time, I could definitely see the debate for him being one spot lower. But for this list, I do have him here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6. And I didn't know what to do with these next two. I really debated these next two placements, as I feel like these people have very different issues that kind of even out. But number 6, I am going with the person that probably was in the majority for more of the game, but also had less win equity, and that person is Angelina. And obviously, Angelina is a fantastic character. And to be fair, her game here isn't terrible, though I do think she has plenty of unforced errors there. Now, I do think early on she's in a pretty good spot. She is able to build this core with the likes of Kara and Natalia. She also had a very strong relationship with John Hennigan. It does seem like she was in a very strong spot initially on that Goliath group. After the swap, she is once again in the majority, where her, Nick, and Mike become the majority there. Though at the same time, she also has the whole jacket situation where she does vote with Natalie during that round in an effort to get Natalie's jacket, which I don't think is a particularly good look for her. And she is the target by leaders of the following round, though it was a pretty consensus vote by that point. So again, not really bad from a position standpoint. But I do feel like Angelina's game is pretty good, at least in the pre-merge. But I think around the merge is where her game really goes downhill, where at that point she is technically a part of the majority, where the Goliaths do have the numbers, they are able to take out Elizabeth, though along the way she does want to target Christian at that round and is unsuccessful in getting her way there. But obviously the big moment here is when she decides to tell Elizabeth before Tribal that she's going home in an effort to get her jury vote, which is a terrible move across multiple fronts. One is that it causes Elizabeth to target Angelina at that Tribal and to really put her on blast in the middle of Tribal, exposing the entire situation there, while also souring her relationship with everyone still in the game at that point, to where it becomes very unlikely that she wins a jury vote moving forward. But additionally, it does cause Angelina to be the decoy target coming to the next round, where the Goliaths want to use that situation to tell the Davids to put their votes onto Angelina, which puts her in a pretty precarious spot there, especially when she knows that Christian could have an idol played on him. And we do see her begging Dan to use his idol on her, and while Dan eventually capitulates and does use the idol on Angelina, we also saw Dan at one point consider not using the idol and letting Angelina go. And even beyond that, the whole display of her begging Dan and telling Dan to make sure that it's on her only worsens her perception and causes players to not take her that seriously in the game. After that, she is blindsided when Dan goes out. That's not particularly great. And while we later see her flipping to the David side to where she's working with them for the next couple rounds, I do feel like a big issue with Angelina during her early merge is that she's simply at the bottom of whatever power structure she's in, where early on she was at the bottom of the Goliath Alliance, and even after she flips to the David side, she's still on the bottom of that group, pretty much just taking Gabby's spot within that. But then we get to the final 9 where she's blindsided once again, where Carl goes out. But I think her game recovers a bit at the final 8, where at that point she does reconnect with Mike. And from that point on, they are essentially able to run the game, where they're able to take off a lot of the old Davids, people like Gabby, Christian, and Davey. At the final 5, they are able to pick up Nick, and they are able to get towards the end of the game in a pretty safe spot, though you also have her tricking Allison with the fake idol at the final 5, which also harmed her perception, and really by that point she was not winning the game, where at that point no one really took her seriously, and she had already done enough things that really harmed her perception to where she doesn't really win the game against really anyone at the end, which you do have to falter for, and also the fact that she was pretty much out of control for a lot of the early merge. But I do feel like her pre-merge was pretty good for the most part, and I feel like her end game was good enough to where she could be this high on the list. But really beyond that, I feel like it's the fact that she just couldn't win at the end is a big reason why I have her here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and again, I did debate this one with Angelina, but I feel like this person had more win equity by the end of it, and here we have Davey. And again, I did debate this considering I think Davey's pre-merge is worse than Angelina's, and I feel like even after the merge, while he does have plenty of control there, I do feel like Angelina probably had control for more rounds of the game. But again, I think win equity is a big factor in why I have Davey above Angelina. Now again, early on, he's not technically in the majority where he is on the outs during the Jessica vote, but at the same time, he does have plenty of good bonds with the other side to where he's able to reintegrate after that Jessica vote. After the swap, he is in a pretty precarious spot to where he is considered one of the targets there, and I feel like he's largely stayed due to Natalia sticking by her guns and targeting Elizabeth over him, where people like Alec would have preferred to target him over the likes of Elizabeth. So I do feel like he is able to pick up that situation there, and they are able to have the majority afterwards where Carl joins their tribe. Though obviously, if they were to go back to tribal, it is a bit questionable over whether the Davids would hold the numbers there, but still able to get through that all right. So again, I do feel like compared to Angelina, I do feel like Davies pre-merge, he's not in as much control compared to her, but I feel like he's a good enough social player to where he's able to get out of bad situations and is able to get through a lot of that round pretty unscathed. After the merge, he is down in numbers with the other Davids and he's kind of just there for the Elizabeth vote. But then the following round, we do see him working alongside Nick and Carl to pull off the minority vote split, where he does have the idol that can be used on Christian there, and then later rearranging the votes to take out John. All that's pretty good. After that, they are able to stay together again, taking out Dan at the final 11, Alec at the final 10, and they are able to have the majority coming into the final 9, only for Gabby and Christian to flip at that point, which is not particularly great, where he is blindsided there and losing Carl. And really from the final 9, I do think Davies' game starts to crumble again, where at the final 8, he tries to take out Christian, is unsuccessful there. At the final 7, he does put his votes onto Allison, voting alongside Christian, only to not get his way there. And then at the final 6, he is taken out himself. So in a lot of ways, I feel like Davies' game is hard to assess, where I feel like his early game, he's kind of rocky. I feel like towards the tail end of his run, he's also pretty rocky. And even the post-swap is not without its issues. I do feel like the main point of the game where he's in control is during that early merge, and while I do give him a lot of credit for that, I feel like the fact that the rest of his game isn't as consistent is a big reason why I can't have him higher. But again, I do feel like he has more of a shot of winning compared to Angelina. I feel like he does win if he gets towards the end against certain people. And I feel like he did pretty good social work at the points where he was on the outs to ensure that he wasn't being targeted. So it is kind of a tough game to assess, but I feel like it's the fact that he had more win equity by the end of it that leaves him here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and I feel like this person's win equity is also pretty suspect, but I feel like their games are more consistent than the likes of Angelina and Davey, but we do have Kara, the final juror of the season. Now, I think the thing about Kara is I don't think she necessarily played a dominant game, and there were definitely points where she was on the outs, but I feel like for the most part, she was part of the majority for a decent amount of her run here. Now, early on, she's in a pretty good spot on the original Goliath tribe, where her, Angelina, and Natalia had a pretty solid core there, and she also had her showmans with Dan that put her in a pretty good spot, and she is part of the eventual Jeremy vote that happens before the swap. So again, pretty good start to her game. I do feel like her swap is pretty rocky, where she does end up being blindsided at the Natalia vote, losing one of her closest allies there, and we also see her losing the numbers after Carl joins their tribe, to where she could have been in danger had they ever gone back to tribal, but is able to scrape through that. After the merge, we do see her being part of the Goliath alliance that does have the majority initially, though they are outplayed at the John Hennigan vote. But I do feel like afterwards, I think Kara plays somewhat well, where at that point we do see her aligning with the likes of Alec and Allison, and we do see them being able to get back into the majority of the following round, where they do work with the Davids to take out Dan, splitting their votes on Angelina. And while it's not ideal that she's turning on her own showmans this early in the game, I think the fact that she was willing to work with Alec and Allison at that point shows that she's pretty flexible within the game, and she's able to remain the majority of the next couple rounds, taking out Alec at the final 10. At the final 9, is able to work with Gabby and Christian to flip the game on the Carl, although she is left out on the Gabby blindside at the final 8, where she was one of the votes for Christian there, only for Christian to play as idol, though at the final 7 she does pivot back around to taking out Christian. And the final 6, the Goliaths do sit together in taking out David. But I think the final 5 on is where things get a bit tricky for Kara, where at that point she does lose Allison, who at that point was the main person willing to take her to the end, considering that Angelina, Mike, and Nick were a clear final 3 by that point, which kind of put her on the outs there. And at the final 4, while she does lose the fire-making challenge, she probably would have been voted out there even if it were a standard vote. So in a lot of ways, I feel like Kara's endgame, she kind of ran out of runway. And I do also question her win equity by the end of it, where I do struggle to see how she wins at the end unless it's a final 2 against Angelina. But I do feel like Kara played a somewhat consistent game where she was in the majority, at least for most of the post-merge, and early on she was in a good spot there. I do feel like her post-swap is pretty rocky, and the tail end of her game is also pretty bad. But I do feel like her game as a whole was a bit more consistent than the likes of Davey and Angelina, which leaves her here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and again, I also debated this one with Kara, but I do feel like this person did have more win equity by the end, and that person is Allison. And I think Allison played a pretty solid game for the most part, though it's not without its issues. Now early on, she is part of the majority on the Goliath tribe. I wouldn't say she's in the core of it, where I feel like she's more so on the outskirts of the majority, but still she's pretty safe there during the Jeremy vote. After the swap, she is in a pretty interesting spot where she is part of the Goliath majority there, but also is able to build a bond with Gabby, and it would have been interesting to see how she navigates that vote if they had gone the tribal, but they were able to win their way to the merge. After the merge, she is once again in a pretty solid spot where she, along with Alec and Mike, are able to build that Strike Force alliance with the other Davids while still being part of the Goliath majority herself, and is able to be in the majority during that early vote, taking out Elizabeth. And while she is on the outs of the following round where John Hennigan goes out, we do see her playing pretty well at that point, where again she does align with Alec and Kara, where they agreed to work with the Davids. And while Nick is weary of her to where he ends up stealing her vote at the next round, I feel like she's able to remain in a pretty good spot afterwards, to where we do see her being part of the Alec vote at the final 10. But from the final 9 on, we do see her becoming a pretty big target in the game, to where the Davids do target her at the final 9, only to be saved by Gabby and Christian flipping to save her. And I do think you have to give Allison some credit for that, considering the bond that she had built with Gabby up to that point. Now the final 8 is a bit of a mess, considering that she does work with Gabby to try to blindside Christian, only for Christian to play an idol. And while she is targeted by the other side, she is instead saved to take Gabby out, which I don't think is good for her position, and the fact that she was targeted there isn't great. We then get to the final 7, where she is targeted once again, though by that point the Goliaths had the majority, and with Christian being a pretty big threat, they do take him out there. Final 6, again, being targeted again, but they're able to take out Davey at that point. But obviously from the final 5, she is such a big threat that we do see her eventually be taken out after she fails to win immunity there. And while she does get pretty unlucky by Nick winning immunity there, the fact that she was already a target for the last couple of rounds made it so that she was going to be targeted eventually anyway. But I do feel like Allison's game here is pretty interesting. And I did consider putting her a little bit lower, considering how big of a threat she was from the final 9 on, as I feel like it's not too dissimilar from someone like Christian. But I think what puts Allison above Christian for me is, one, Christian was targeted much earlier than her, but also, I don't think Allison needed idols to get through a lot of the game, where even at the points where she was being targeted, she had allies on her side that were willing to keep her around, which I do find a bit more impressive than someone like Christian, who needed advantages to get through a lot of those rounds where he was being targeted. So I feel like those things elevate Allison above Christian for me. Then also she comes relatively close to winning, to where she does have a decent amount of win equity as she gets to the end. It's just a question of getting there. But I do find Allison's game here somewhat impressive, and she was in the majority for a decent amount of the game. That leaves her here number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and I feel like this top 2 should be pretty obvious, as it is the top 2 of the season, and it's just a question of ordering them. But number 2, and this is pretty similar to my Ghost Island player ranking, I do have the winner of the season, and here we have Nick Wilson. And I do think Nick played a pretty solid game for the most part, as I feel like he had a decent amount of control during the early merge, and I feel like even before that, he had decent control in his swap tribe, though I think the tail ends of his game are pretty rocky. Now again, early on, he's in a pretty rough spot initially, to where he would have been targeted at that first tribal had they gone to it, and while I don't think it's a guarantee that he goes home at that first tribal, he definitely gets votes there, which is not particularly great. But I do feel like after Pat gets medevac, he recovers pretty well, to where we do see him connecting with a lot of his tribe. He connects well with Davey, connects well with Christian, and he is part of the majority when Jessica gets taken out, which is all pretty good. After that tribal, we do see him avoiding a lot of the blame for that by throwing Gabby under the bus, which I feel like is all pretty good. After the swap, while he is down in numbers, we do see him building a very strong bond with Mike White along with Angelina, and they are able to be the majority when they eventually go to tribal, taking out Natalie and Lyrsa. So all in all, I do think his pre-merge is pretty solid, despite him being on the outs during that first round. After the merge, we do see him being pulled into the Strike Force Alliance, and while they do lose a number in Elizabeth, we later see him orchestrate the minority vote split. And I do feel like out of all the Davids there, I do feel like Nick deserves the most credit for that eventual vote, where he is the one to get the information from people like Alec and Mike that Christian is getting the votes. He then goes up to Davey, telling him to play his advantage at that point, and he is able to arrange the votes in a way that allows John to go home at the point where Dan plays his idol on Angelina. So I do feel like you have to give Nick a lot of credit for that. And after that round, we do see him using his vote steal and Allison to take out Dan, and obviously with the idol nullifier, he is able to get his way there. After that, takes out Alec at the final 10. So I do feel like those 3 rounds of him taking out John, Dan, and Alec are extremely impressive on Nick's end, and I do feel like you have to give Nick a lot of credit for those moves. Though obviously the final 9 is where things kind of go off the rails, where At the final 9, he's blindsided when Carl goes out. That's not particularly great. At the final 8, he does try to flip the game on Christian, only for that to backfire. You also have the final 7, where even though he votes correctly in taking out Christian, he also gets really paranoid at tribal to where he ends up wasting his idol on himself, which isn't ideal. And from the final 6 on, he wins out. He wins those final 3 immunities of the season to get to the end. And it's a debate over whether he actually needed those immunities. Where I think at the final 6, you can definitely make a case that he needed it, considering Davey is eventually targeted and he doesn't get his way there. But I think final 5 is probably not as bad, to where, again, Allison gets taken out at 5, Carrot gets taken out at 4. But I do think if he lost final 4 immunity, he could have been put into fire. So again, even that's not particularly great. But I do feel like his end game is pretty rocky for the most part. And I do think that kind of sours my view on his game, to where I feel like if it wasn't for that, and had he been able to maintain the control that he had during that early merge, I think he probably would have been a top tier winner of the show. But I think considering that he is on the outs from the final 9 on, I do think that kind of lowers my opinion of his game. Then also, he could have been the first boot of the season had they gone to that tribal. I do think it's a rocky game for the most part, but I do feel like that middle stretch of his game is extremely impressive, and a big reason why he's not lower on the winner ranking than what he already is. But I do feel like the tail ends of his game are what holds me back from having him higher, which is why he's here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe played the best game on David versus Goliath is Mike White. And this is a similar case to Ghost Island in the sense that I would have voted for the runner-up over the eventual winner here, as I feel like Mike played an extremely impressive game for the most part. Now early on, he's not necessarily in the core of things, where he ends up getting in trouble early on for idol hunting, and he eventually loses Jeremy at that first tribal, which isn't ideal for his game, but he gets a pretty beneficial swap to where he is essentially in the center of that Jabeni tribe, is able to pull in Nick to form the majority there, takes out Natalie and Lirza without too much difficulty there, and I would say even gets his way over Nick in terms of taking out Lirza at that point, so I feel like that's pretty good. And then we get to the merge, where he is the main orchestrator of the Strike Force Alliance, where he's able to pull in all the Davids he was close to, like Nick, Gabby, and Christian. He's able to pull in Alec and Allison. And that did seem to be the secret alliance that could have run the game moving forward, playing the middle off of each other. But I do feel like he makes a bit of a misstep the following round, where he ends up deciding to target Christian and getting all the Goliaths on board to do so, completely dismantling the alliance that he had built just the previous round, which I feel like really could have backfired on him, considering that it could have undermined the trust that he had built with the Davids that he pledged to work with. And obviously he doesn't get his way there, where obviously the idol gets played on Christian and loses John Hannigan, which I don't think is that ideal for his game. And then we also see him being on the outs during the Dan vote. So again, I feel like those 2 rounds are pretty rocky for him, and I feel like he definitely made a mistake there in turning on the Strike Force Alliance as soon as he did. But I do feel like he's able to recover pretty well, where we do see him building this relationship with Christian that allows him to be in the majority moving forward. Where coming to the final 9, he is able to pull in Gabby and Christian to blindside Carl there, and I feel like he's able to take control back in the game from the Davids. And then we get to the final 8, where he is the one to split the vote onto Gabby after Christian plays the idol, saving Allison over Gabby there. And I feel like that's all really impressive. Final 7, he is a key factor in the eventual Christian blindside. And he essentially runs this end game where he is a key factor in taking out pretty much everyone from the final 9 on and being the key decision maker behind all these votes. Now, yes, there is a minor hiccup at the final 4 where he is throwing the fire after Nick wins immunity, but is able to take care of that. And coming in the final tribal, despite him being the celebrity and someone who clearly had money already, he still had a shot of winning the game, where he ends up getting 3 jury votes on his side, and one of them being Christian, someone that Nick also had a good relationship with. And I feel like had he done more to advocate for his game, I feel like there's a chance that he could have won even against Nick. But I think by the end of it, he kind of felt bad about taking the money away from Nick and kind of took his foot off the gas, which does allow Nick to win by the end of it. Though at the same time, Nick also played a pretty solid game on his own. But I feel like just looking at how the game played out, I feel like Mike had more control at more points compared to Nick. Or yes, he is on the outs early on, and even after the merge, he is on the outs in a couple of votes, and you have him flipping on Christian as early as he did. I feel like he played a more consistent game than Nick. I feel like he was more dominant in the game compared to Nick, at more points compared to Nick, which I feel like is a big reason why I would have voted for Mike over Nick by the end of it. Now, yes, I do understand why Nick won by the end of it, but at the same time, I feel like Mike played a more consistent game compared to Nick, which is why I do have him here at number 1. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps with the channel. Now, I'll probably be doing this for more seasons down the road, so you can look forward to that, along with other general Survivor content. I'm on Patreon, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description, and you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.